Would you like to make a master bass template for your music productions? Then keep watching! Alright, now I will share the entire process I personally use to create a master bass template. I use 3 layers, which is enough to create a full bass sound. Layer 1. I always start by creating the depth and roundness of the bass, the low end that will be felt to the bone if you have a big enough speaker system. I have found that a warm and deep sub-bass tone works great for this. The focus range of this layer is between 20 and 100 Hz, so I put a low-pass filter just above 100 Hz. This is the easiest layer to create, and most often you will not have to change this layer when starting a new track. You only need to dial in the right amount of sub-bass in the mix. Here is some advice for you. Never add effects on this layer, because you want the low end of your mix to be clear and controlled. Adding effects to the low-end frequencies is a recipe for a muddy mix. Alright, now let's take a listen to an example of the end result of this layer. Layer 2. Here is where I add the body of the bass, the fat and punch. This is the layer that will be heard the most and basically be the main part of the bass sound. Sometimes I use an electric bass sound for this layer, and other times I use a synth bass. Since layer 1 takes care of the deep low end, I filter out everything below 100 Hz on this layer. And since I know I will have a third layer for the top end of the bass, I also add a filter to cut out everything above the low mids, usually around 1 kHz or so. Then I also add a bit of saturation to this layer to make it sound really fat and warm. If you want your final bass sound for your track to be really big and wide, this is the layer where you want to add stereo effects like chorus or unison. Here's an example of how this layer can sound if you are going for a more electric bass feel. And if you want that really big and wide synth bass sound, it can sound like this. Just be aware that making the bass sound bigger and wider means that you will have less space in your mix for other instruments. In fact, that is a good rule of thumb you should remember. Think of a track like a cake. The bigger the sound you make, the bigger the slice of the cake it will take. Layer 3. This is where you add the spark and air to the bass. This is the layer that will make the bass audible even on tiny speakers. I start by cutting everything below 1 kHz, since layer 1 and 2 takes care of that range. Then I usually add a sound that has some pluck to it, a short staccato type of sound. This will make sure the full bass sound will be heard on every speaker, but still not take up too much space in the mid-frequency spectrum. Here is an example of how this layer can sound. So how do you stack these layers together into one single master bass sound? Well, basically you have 2 options. The first and most common option is to use a group track in your DAW and add 3 different instrument plugins to that group. Then you play and record all MIDI on this group track itself. When you do this, all 3 tracks that belong to the group will play the same MIDI. The result of this is a master bass sound with 3 separate layers. The second option, which I personally use, is to use a multi-part instrument plugin so that you can add all layers inside the same plugin. I use Omnisphere or Trillion for this, and then I choose stacking mode, which basically means layering all sounds into one. After you have set up all 3 layers and stack them together using one of the methods I mentioned, you can start being really creative by adding effects to each layer of the bass. The really great thing is that you can add different effects to each layer. But remember to be careful with effects on the sub-bass layer to keep the low end clean in the mix. The final step is to mix the sound level of the layers and add the master effects to polish the complete bass sound. Usually a compressor and tone shaping EQ is enough here. But you might want to add a bass amp if you want to shape the complete bass sound in a more extreme way. Now go create some massive bass. I'm Mike, signing out, and you rock, my friends!
Click the subscribe button and feel the power.
My name is Mike, and if you make music, I would like to invite you to the Music Makers Group. Check the link in the description.